Hey everybody, welcome back to Authentic. Roger here with Sunshine Sinclair, and we're doing a quick spot rep on the E-18 Growler crash in San Diego that happened Wednesday morning, 12 February. So, very serious subject, so do away with some of our normal levity that Shine and I have. And before I turn it over to Shine to talk through this, I just want to say, first off, we are not putting any blame anywhere right now. We are just giving an assessment of what we know. And there's very little official word out. So what you're going to see Shine do an assessment on is what I would call OSINT, or open source intelligence, taking some public record information and Sunshine's long experience both as an aviator, a test pilot, and someone who routinely flew in and out of North Island to, again, talk about some things we can look at as more information comes out. So with that, let's jump right in with Sunshine. And Shine, let's really quickly, for anyone who doesn't know, give a brief overview of what an EA-18 is.
Yeah, you bet, Roger. Thanks for having me, man. It's good to be back.
Absolutely.
So, and it's a good news story here because it's a miracle, twofold miracle, excuse me. So we had a jet crash near basically downtown San Diego. No one on the ground was hurt, and the aircrew survived. So I think, so anyway, this is, despite we lost an aircraft, it is a good news story. And that aircraft, though, that we lost, so the EA-18G, kind of a mouthful there. So the Growler, we just call it the Growler, right? The predecessor was the Prowler, the EA-6B. And the Growler here is part of Boeing's, I'm going to call it Super Hornet family. So there's an FA-18E, an F, so E is a single seat model, F is the dual seat model, and then the G is kind of the souped up version. When I mean souped up, or when I say souped up, I'm thinking electronics wise, right? It's a job as electronic attack. So if we were to take a snapshot in time of acquisition where they're purchasing an E, an F, and a G, we'll call it, the Growler, the G is going to be a little more expensive, just the baseline, if you will. So the airframe itself's got some extra pieces of metal on it, as well as some extra wiring in it. And that's going to bring the cost just under $80 million, whereas the E and the F models are closer to 65. So you're looking at maybe a 20% or so increase. Now, when you strap the additional ALQ pods, of which there are 3, to the Growler, that price is going to go up closer to $120 million. So it's a very expensive piece of gear, if you will. We have fewer of those than we do the E's and the F's, so we call that a basically low density but high demand, if you will. So we really want them in the service, and there's just not enough of them. It's because they're so expensive, so it's a high value asset. The G model that crashed in San Diego was part of VAQ 135 called the Black Ravens. They're based out of NAS, or Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, which is up by the in the Seattle area, so Seattle, Washington. And I think that's going to play a part into this when we talk about the weather. So the Seattle weather and the San Diego weather, a little different, but on this day, they were actually pretty darn similar. So electronic attack is the main mission of the Growler. And Scott, when I say electronic attack, or sorry, Roger, when I say electronic attack, I'm thinking more of, I'm going to go throw some Trons downrange, and it's going to disrupt or jam the enemy radar. So hopefully the fighters are kind of masks, so the bad guys don't see us coming, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And just one more point on that. This is a strategic asset in some way.
Great point.
In some ways, because through various agreements, the Air Force no longer has airborne tactical jammers. Those went away with the EF-111. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is actually an expeditionary squadron, correct? It's not a carrier air wing squadron. It's an expeditionary squadron, if memory serves, designed to support Air Force and Navy missions.
You are correct. I'm pretty sure it is not carrier based. Yeah, and I got word on the street that I think that they were actually supporting an Air Force exercise. So that would be, to your point, absolutely correct for the Black Raven. So very expensive splash that we saw back on Wednesday. I'll say that. So
right. So
yeah,
let's talk about the conditions at the time of the incident. You mentioned they were out of the Whidbey Island area up in the coastal Washington area. What were the conditions like in San Diego, and how do we think that may or may not have played a part?
Yeah, so it was not a typical San Diego day. So I am here in San Diego, and the sun was not out. The field was reporting overcast at 600 feet, so the clouds were down to 600 feet, which is pretty darn low. It's actually below pattern altitude, if you will. So if we're doing kind of circling to land, if you will, we'll be in the clouds as opposed to in the clear. They were also reporting light rain, fog, and to me, when those two are together, I tend to think of wet runways. So limited horizontal visibility as well as vertical visibility, and then a wet runway. So to me, although these guys are from the Seattle area, so I'm sure they're used to it, especially flying around this stuff in the Seattle winter, right? But the Seattle runways are a little different than the North Island runways, and we'll get into that, I think, when we talk about the actual flow. So overall, I'm going to say the weather definitely didn't help them this day.
Sure. And, in case people aren't aware, it may not be something if you just fly commercially you really think about. Aircraft landing on a runway are subject to all the laws of physics that you are when you're driving on a wet freeway. So, speed, maneuvering, wet roads, hydroplaning, this can all happen. And we'll take a look and see what we think happens. So with that, do you want to go ahead and pull up the data that you do have, Shine? And
Sure.
I'll let you describe what this is.
Okay.
I want to reiterate to our viewers, this is open source. I'm sure Sunshine is going to mention as well. We are conjecturing from a lot of good indicators that this is the plane in question, but we will just go ahead and step through this here and let Shine describe what we believe happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you have here, if you can see, and I kind of, we need this open space here because the plane's eventually going to head down there. I'll show you. But what you have here, if you can see my arrow or cursor, is going to be NAS North Island. So North Island has an 8,000-foot north-south runway, and then basically an east-west runway that's runway 2911. So 2911 is traditionally used for VFR. That's where I'd fly out of all the time. And then you fly out over the bay here, and you just got to be careful. This is Point Loma, so this is they have an elevation to them, if you will, and there's a bunch of houses there, obviously, and submarines down in the water. So it's something you want to avoid. Runway 29, though, is kind of the standard arrival and departure runway, especially for the fighters, I should say. And this is where Top Gun 2 was filmed. So we used it quite extensively for that motorcycle scene, if you will. So that's North Island. Over here, overall, is Coronado. And then to the north is going to be the commercial airfield, Lindbergh, right, where you'd fly in via Southwest. What you see here is going to be, and once again, can't emphasize enough, this is circumstantial evidence. This is a website. It's a flight tracker. All it does is take ADS-B data, which is going to be an automatic dependent transmission that comes out of the planes. Now, the military planes don't traditionally the fighters, do not have ADS-B, but there will be guys on the ground that have radar contacts. Those radar contacts are then pushed into the system via something called TISB, we just call it. So basically telemetry instrumentation stuff that gets piped into the internet. So you have radar returns as well as aircraft reporting returns, and you get this kind of composite picture. So with this composite picture, what you see here is what we consider circumstantial evidence, but I feel like this is probably the Growler when it took off. So now to orient you guys, we talked about the map, but if you come down here, you're going to notice the time, and it says 1806 actually Zulu. Now the plane, all we know from open source news information is that the plane ejected about 10:15 in the morning, and you can see that says 1800 or 6 p.m. Well, that's Zulu. That's based on the prime meridian or time over in England. San Diego is 8 hours behind. So when you take 18 minus 8, you get 10. So that tells me this is 10 a.m. local, or really 10:06 local. So what I'm going to do here, and this is obviously this occurred on Wednesday. You can see the date down here, Wednesday, February 12th, right after 10 a.m. local. And I'll just hit play. I'm going to click on this guy so you can see his ground path. So the first thing of note is that when they take off, it's real, the standard departure, we'll say, is going to be you need to have a tight turn so you stay inside the bay and you don't overfly Point Loma. So I'm wondering, and these guys, they're consummate professionals, right? They've been through 2.5 years of flight school. They're not sloppy in their airmanship. I can guarantee you that any naval aviator is not going to be sloppy in his airmanship, especially when folks are on the ground and, you've got noise abatement issues. So I'm wondering if this wider turn could have been because there was some kind of an emergency on takeoff that would take the air crew. Remember, this is a two-seater. I wonder if some of their attention could have been taken away from maneuvering inside or turning inside of Point Loma because they're dealing with some kind of aircraft emergency. But that is merely speculation.
Quick question, Shine. Is there a potential that if they had some power affecting issue, they also might not want to maneuver as hard as they normally might?
That's a great point. Yes. So it depends if they have an engine failure of some sort, because the Growler has two engines, obviously, and they train us not to turn into the bad engine or turn violently into the bad engine anyway. So potentially, let's say that the left engine had some kind of issues and they didn't want to make a left tight turn because that can actually induce some yaw, if you will. And it's very, I'm going to call it proverse yaw, but basically when you turn, the nose tends to slide down or slice down. And if you turn too sharply, it'll slice further down. And if you have one engine that's not good, then you have additional yaw, and it can just be a very bad situation that gets worse. So yeah, it could absolutely be an issue with their left engine making a wide turn. Cool, good point. To orient you guys, if you can see over here where my cursor's circling, you're going to see this is the aeronautical data for it. So it says barometric altitude, so he's up at 1,800 feet. You can see the up triangle, if you will, so he's in a climb. And this is the ground speed, so that's going to be the airspeed plus the wind speed, if you will. But it should be a pretty good indicator of the actual speed, if you will. So as they're climbing away, they've probably already retracted the landing gear, which the gear speed there is going to be about 250, I think. Yeah, so they're well under gear speed, so they're going to bring up the gear, and they'll start to climb up. Now, traditional missions are going to have us head out south here, as you can imagine. So if he were to go wings level and start trundling south, I'd say, oh, okay, well, he's pressing on his mission. That makes plenty of sense. But what you're going to see is he actually kind of starts turning back toward the field a little bit. So he's heading south here. And I'll stop it in a potato. But now, okay, there you go. So that, to me, is like, okay, he's not going out on a mission. He just took off. My best guess is if I had an emergency on takeoff, I would circle to land. And because the conditions are such that, remember, the clouds are down at 600 feet, so he's probably in the clouds because he's up at 2,000 feet. He's not going to make a tight turn and head right back to the initial for runway 29. He's probably under what we call a ground-controlled approach, or GCA control, or GCA ground-controlled approach, or in the GCA box, excuse me. So in the GCA box, the pattern altitude, I think, is 2,000 or 2,200, right? And then what they're going to do is they're going to drive you down here further south and set you up for the extended center line on runway 29. And I think you'll see that's what's going to happen with this guy. So he's now under radar control. He's in the clouds. So he's just expecting the guys on the ground to keep him clear of not flying into areas where he shouldn't be. And you'll see him start to do a left-handed hook here to intercept the extended runway center line. Once again, I'm going to pause it for a second here. So here's that runway in question, runway 29. He's probably targeting. So you can see the extended center line brings him out here. So in a few potatoes or a few seconds, you should see him start to turn left again. Now notice his airspeed. He's up at 254 knots, so he's just a tad fast. Our pattern speed there is usually around 230, but 250 is still within legal bounds, if you will. And he's up at 2,000 feet, so he's pretty steady. So to me, once again, this is good indication that this individual, whoever it may be, potentially the Growler, is in the GCA box, and he's coming back for a quick landing. All right, there you can see him turning the final. And as he turns the final, you're going to notice his airspeed starts to decay, right, which is good. So he's basically, when he gets about 10 miles, he should be dirty, so he should have his landing gear and flaps configured for a landing approach. And that's where you're going to see typical landing weight approach speeds would be about 130 to 150 on the high side, or kind of the heavy side, if you will. Because as you know, the heavier you are, the faster on speed will be. So kind of just the numbers to eyeball here, not really hawk, but just kind of eyeball scan every now and then as I hit play, and you'll see him come in here. So a little correction there back to center line. Looks like he's pretty much intercepted center line. Now he's heading toward runway 29. And during the day, and then just to his left is going to be just about the Hotel Del Coronado at this point. Or I'm sorry, the K, excuse me. And Hotel Del is going to be right about here.
Right.
So for VFR traffic, if it were a clear day, What he probably would have done, or what I would have done if my landing weight was such, I didn't have to go dump any gas, is I would do a quick turn up to pattern altitude, about 1,500 feet, and then just circle back in here to land. And we always avoid the Hotel Del because a long time ago we had an S3 that dropped a panel into their swimming pool. So we have agreed to sidestep the Hotel Del on our approach to 2.9. So we have a little dog leg. Now, when there's clouds in the area, that agreement, if you will, is off, and we just basically fly radar vectors that sometimes can take us right over the Del. Okay, so now he's pretty much on final. You're going to notice his airspeed there, 150, right? So he's probably gear down. He's slowing down his on-speed if he hasn't already captured it. On-speed being the optimal landing speed, if you will, or really angle of attack. And now look at the altimeter. So the base altitude is at 200 feet, so he's pretty low, right? But on glide slope, if you will. And then he's in a descent. So what happens is you may ask, what's a WIGS 84 altitude? That's a GPS-based altitude, and it assumes that the Earth is a oblate spheroid, they call it. So basically, that's a GPS altitude. This is an air pressure-based altitude. So at this point, I'm probably going to be looking at the baro altimeter over the GPS altimeter in my jet. So he's at 200 feet, 150 knots. See him fly over the base. Now he's on final. You're going to see he's, okay, so now baro altitude. So he's probably touched down at this point, and he's at 128 knots. So he's touched down. Ideally, he's going to be slowing down shortly. And also notice the time. It's now, remember we said 18 minus 8, so it's 10, 13:30 local, and he has just touched down. Now, unfortunately, the radar data is going to disappear at this point. So you're going to see he's just going to be kind of a stale track here. I'm going to pause it again. And you'll notice that basically the last data point was he was 128 knots, and basically I'm just going to call that at sea level, 100 feet, minus 100 feet. So my guess is now it's 10:14. He probably took off again, and this is where the eyewitness accounts are more important, obviously, than the radar tapes. And that is some folks that are on the base said that they saw him do a touchdown and then basically take off again, or what I call go around. So some people may call it a touch and go. I get it. But touch and go for me is a training thing or a fun thing. And when the clouds are at 600 feet, I would not be doing touch and goes for fun, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And in this case, probably as part of presumably the larger Air Force exercise coming all the way down from Whidbey, full load, 2 bags and 3 jammer pods, doesn't seem like a logical time to just be doing touch and goes for training.
That's excellent contextual evidence, I would say, right? So yeah, those are all, I think, very valid assumptions. He had a full tank of gas taken off, the 3 jammer pods of which we spoke earlier, or you spoke actually, in the 2 tanks. So he's a heavy guy coming down on a shorter runway when we talked about potentially wet too. So This is where he is going to be called upon with his good airmanship to figure out what to do with the aircraft, right?
Really quickly, because I know we want to start talking about what could have gone wrong. An excellent analysis of this track, regardless of what it is. Excellent analysis.
Thank you.
Normally, there is no normal, right? Because it always depends. But normally, if you've got an aviation issue, you want to come in light, right? Like we see it in commercial aviation when airliners dump gas before they land if they have to, make an emergency landing short of their intended destination. You guys would dump gas coming back to the boat to get within arresting gear mins. This guy did not take any time to go dump fuel, correct? The amount of time we see him circling, am I right in my assessment that that was not enough time to dump an appreciable weight's worth of gas?
Great point, Roger. Yeah, and I don't. Also, he didn't. If you notice, he was at 2,000 feet, and our rules traditionally are you got to climb up above 6,000 feet to dump gas to allow it to atomize before it touches the surface. In this case, the ocean. So, yeah, based on his profile and also his time airborne, so his altitude profile and his airborne, and his airborne time. If he did dump, I don't know how much it would have affected his weight. And I have no indications of on speed, obviously, at this point, or really, which would be a corollary to his weight. But based on the approach speeds there, the 156 that we saw earlier, and granted, that's a ground speed, so there's wind mixed in there, and the winds were out of the south at about 17 knots, but still, it's a, based on his approach speed, I'm going to say he was probably pretty heavy. Not too heavy, right? And I'm not poking him in the eye here.
Right.
But my guess, honestly, because of the Point Loma departure, if you will, where he climbs out over Point Loma, and then the immediate turn around to land, that there was some very dire, I would say, emergency in the cockpit.
Right. So, yeah, and I mean, clearly, I'm not an aviator, but just with the knowledge I have, it does seem like whatever happened, and again, we are not placing blame at all. I mean, they managed to not put it into a San Diego neighborhood, and they both survived.
Amen.
So,
Amen.
you know, without getting political, we can replace money, even if it's our tax dollars, to replace that plane. We can't replace lives.
I agree.
So all that being said, it sounds like, like you said, he was dealing with some sort of emergency. Not saying you're attributing this to any one particular of these emergencies, but what kind of things could cause this?
So it could be, so when I was there, I flew a bunch and I had hydraulic issues. So the jets, both of them, whether you were in an E, an F, or a G, they have two hydraulic systems. They're going to run the landing gear, the hook, the brakes, the flaps, all sorts of different control surfaces too. So it could be a hydraulic issue, could be an engine issue. We mentioned earlier there are two of them, and it's very sustainable to fly, even heavy, with just one engine. Not easy, but definitely doable. So I'd say an engine issue or a cabin pressurization. That was the other thing that I had troubles with. I am not sure, and that's kind of why I act like I do now. I was deprived of oxygen for too long. But sorry. But anyway, so there could have been a cabin pressurization issue or some kind of oxygen issue or engine or hydraulic, I would say. But
okay.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about naysayers, right?
Sure.
And rightly so. Call us on things if you think we're wrong. But I'm sure people will say, well, what would it... So an oxygen issue. So what? He's at 2,000 feet. That's not that big a deal. He could just take... Well, the other problem is you're breathing through a contained oxygen system, right? And so if there's a problem with that oxygen system, you need to get on the ground before it turns into a larger situation, right?
Yeah, and we do have an emergency reserve, if you will. So we have our onboard oxygen generation, so OBOGs, and that comes off of bleed air from the engine. So the engine cools down, cleaned up, produces breathable air. But then if that breathable air is contaminated or something's wrong with it, then we have an emergency bottle, we'll call it, of oxygen, and that's limited, right? It's a finite supply. So for me, if I had to pull we call it the green apple, but if I have to pull the emergency oxygen green ring, there you go, formal name, I only have so many minutes of air to land. So I could see this profile would be perfect for either an engine, hydraulic, or an oxygen issue.
Right. And, I know that, thanks to your education, I know that there's something called a bird aircraft strike hazard. You have an acronym for that?
We do. BASH. Yeah. Yep. Right. So I didn't have to deal much with BASH condition, which was great. And maybe that's just dumb luck out of me. But San Diego has seagulls. We're by the ocean, right? A couple herons too. But traditionally, the base has very effective ways of mitigating that. So whether it be noise or, and by noise, I mean sometimes they could even use a guy with a shotgun and it's a blank. It's not shooting, buckshot or anything at the birds. But they have ways to dissipate, I guess you could say, the flocks if they come in to land on the seawall or something like that. But yeah, it could be a bird strike, which would contribute to an engine issue. Absolutely.
Okay. So we've talked through what we know from the track analysis, presuming that's the plane. So there's a lot of eyewitness testimony now. There's video. We'll put some of that up here. There's still photography. Can you tell us what your analysis of what we see after what appears to be either the go around, if you will, or the aborted second takeoff, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, you bet. So, we'll absolutely throw up some photos here, or not throw up, I guess. We'll present some photos here. The one to draw particular attention to is going to be the one where there's an aircraft flying basically unmanned, right? So I'm presuming this is the Growler, and this is going to be post-ejection. So if you're looking at that, you're going to see some kind of wingtip vortices really coming off the thing. So that tells me it's relatively slow. You're going to see that it's cocked up. And if you zoom in, you'll see there's no canopy, there's no air crew. So to me, that's in a stable landing configuration. What I mean by that is the landing gear's down, right? And it looks, even though it's a snapshot, it's not a severe nose down. So I'm going to guess it's a snapshot and the flight path is somewhat level at that point. Now, obviously, it's going to turn into a very steep dive shortly. But to me, this plane is intact. So it's not, a wing hasn't fallen off. It's not on fire, right? I don't see any kind of smoke, anything out of the ordinary coming off that thing. It looks stable. And what I mean by that, it's not in some weird, unusual attitude or severe nose down. And then finally, the landing gear. So the landing gear is down, but the tail hook is not down as best I can tell, right? So to me, if I had an emergency, if I were single engine, we'll call it, I'd probably be taking an arrestment at 2.9 or a short field arrestment or trap, if you will. His tail hook is not down, so perhaps that is not his issue. I don't know. Some of the varsity guys, and this could be one of those guys, but if they miss the wire, as we call it, on landing, the tail hook is still down, and you can actually grind down the hook point on the runway itself, making subsequent attempts useless ineffective, because you grind away the hook point. So if I ever missed the wires on the ground, not on the carrier, I would actually pull up the tail hook, so I would spare the rub, if you will, of losing the hook point. So maybe he missed the wire and pulled up the hook. I have no idea. Mm-hmm. But the configuration is very interesting that he has 3 down and locked. So my guess is just prior to ejection, their intent was still to land. Mm-hmm. And we also have emergency procedures where if you start losing thrust, then you can actually bring the landing gear up to get rid of some of the drag. And they obviously did not retract the landing gear at this time. So,
right. So really quick, and again, coming from the non-aviator, right? Just to confirm my understanding, the arresting gear that we're talking about, it's not carrier training arresting gear. They have this at Air Force airfields, some as well. It's for emergencies like this. And my understanding is there's some airfields that have it at both ends of the runway, some just one. Does North Island have the arresting gear at both ends of the runway? What I'm trying to do is illustrate for the viewer. So if he misses the hook at the beginning of the runway, it's not like he's going to run the length and try and capture the hook at the other end, because if he misses that one, he's way too slow and he's augering in. Am I tracking right?
You are, yeah, great point. So if you can picture a runway, and we'll say the first 25% or so, there's going to be one wire stretched across. The wire is perpendicular, obviously, to the path of the jet. And that we call that the short field gear. And then a lot of instances, the Navy runways, and actually the Air Force, the Air Force calls it the departure end gear. Mm-hmm. The Navy calls it the long field gear. So Navy has the short field closest to the approach end and the long field gear. Air Force has the approach end and the departure end departure end gear. Yeah. And so for runway 29, what I've used, unfortunately, for dual hydraulic failures in the past was the short field gear, because I want the opportunity to grab the wire as soon as possible. If I miss the wire, I want to have available runway so I can take off and try again. Mm-hmm. If you're using the long field gear, you're dragging your hook all the way down to the very end. And if you miss the wire, you're going to get wet almost immediately, meaning you're going to fall into the ocean. So
right.
Personal preference for me is to use the short field gear.
Right. And you've come in, you said, to North Island on that shorter runway, the 290, do I have that number right?
Yeah, 29, runway 29. Yep.
Yeah, runway 29. Mm-hmm. And you've come in on the short runway heavy on a wet day, right?
It wasn't a wet day, but it was definitely a wake-up call. And that was, so I had another type of emergency. It was very clear that day, fortunately, and very dry, so a typical San Diego day. Anyway, I came around, circled to land, and I needed to get the jet on deck immediately, so I didn't have time to dump fuel, that is, And so I came in pretty heavy, which means my approach speed was fast, and I feel like I used every flipping brick of the runway, and I came to stop right at the ragged edge, we'll call it, right before going into the ocean. Yeah.
Okay. So then, just looking to close out here, there have been reports from eyewitnesses that it sounded like to them, and eyewitness reports are exactly that. People have perception, and the
Yes.
brain does strange things. But
Yeah.
eyewitness accounts that the plane did a go around, pitched nose high up. People are saying it sounds like the pilot selected afterburner. Now, I will say this happened right over North Island, so we probably have more educated observers than if this had happened many other places.
Good point.
But then went eerily quiet. Now, I'm not an aviator, so I'm going to let you speculate. I have an idea, but I'm not going to put that out there because it's just unexperienced opinion on my part.
Well, but you're kind of a good DCS player, aren't you? So
Yeah, well, I'm a legend in my own mind. So, yeah.
yeah, no, you bring up a good point. So we have eyewitnesses, and then those eyewitnesses also have ears. So, yeah, so to me, the fact that I really glommed off onto is I listened to the local news here in San Diego where they interviewed multiple different eyewitnesses. Was their oral accounts, I guess, or they're listening what they heard. And yeah, you're exactly right. So for me, with a touch and go, we'll call it, the jet's already moving along at probably about 130 knots. Don't need to really select afterburner to take off again. So I usually just go to military power, and then I'm going to climb up because you got plenty of flyaway speed, as we call it, and power available to make the turn. Now, if he's in extremis, which I get, right? Maybe he's single-ended at this point, or who knows what. Yeah, when he takes off, the witnesses made it sound like, hey, we heard our normal takeoff, which is going to be a military power, still rattles the windows, but then they heard excessive noise, and to me, that would be the afterburner being engaged. Right now, I'm like, that's interesting. And then you had a great point of shortly after the afterburner, it was eerily quiet. I think they mentioned there's some kind of odd whine, which to me could be the engine spooling down, and then relative quiet, right? So when you go from afterburner to basically idle or almost idle, the engine's going to sound pretty much quiet. So I'm thinking, yeah, there's some kind of an engine issue up at altitude. He just took off. He's back. Are back in the clouds. And I don't know their pitch at that point, right? Their orientation. So spatial disorientation or spatial D may have been an issue. I don't know. But I would say definitely something's wrong with the engines at that point. And then shortly after they hear the whisper jet, we'll call it a very quiet jet, they're going to see two orange parachutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what we know now. In summary, to give you a repeat back from the amateur here, is something, if our track assessment is correct, and that is the aircraft, the Growler in question, something apparently happened immediately upon the initial takeoff that caused a deviation from what would be considered a normal North Island departure. They circled around in what was definitely a wider track than normal in some poor weather conditions. Came in a little hotter, and I don't mean that as a pejorative way, just a little faster than normal, which is completely understandable with a heavy jet. And for whatever reason, then had to execute a go-around, and that, for whatever reason, led to them deciding it was time to eject from the aircraft.
Spot on. I love your summary. And once again, these two are professional aviators. They're winged aviators, right? They have my utmost respect and trust. So it's not like they're just messing it up. I think that they, had some very extreme situations up there. I don't know what they were that forced them into this kind of approach. The good news story, though, circling back. So the witnesses mentioned the impact, and you'll watch, hopefully we can show the folks at home the splash video. It's it's kind of a dirt dart profile. So it's a very steep splash in the water. The fisherman that rescued them, the charter boat actually, that had some vacationers on board, believe it or not, that rescued them, he said that the impact with the water, that point was about 1/8 of a mile from the shoreline. So, I mean, if that's not a miracle, Roger, because, there's no one in the plane at that point, and I'm sure.
Right.
And I've had some single engine on takeoff, almost have to eject. I think about where I'm going to point the plane before I leave the jet. These guys, I could see them as part of their scan, if they can see the ground. They may have been in the clouds, right?
Yeah.
But I would also like to point out the picture that we're going to show of the two air crew standing. So it's just a still, but it's amazing to see that they are conscious. They are able to stand, so they're not looking at broken legs or anything like that, And interestingly enough, if you look at the two air crew, look to the guy on the right, you're going to see he's actually wearing his Nomex flight jacket. So that is a unique things to do in the cockpit, is to wear a jacket over top of your gear. So I'm going to guess that he's the EWO, or the guy in the back seat, because pilots, I don't traditionally think we're going to wear our flight jackets in the jet. So my guess is the pilot's the one on the left there that's kind of reaching toward his helmet, and then the EWO is got the jacket on. It looks like he's checking out his phone.
Checking out his phone.
Trying to text his wife or something.
Hey, I got to tell you, if that phone still works, that company needs to make a commercial based on that.
There's a good commercial in the making, right?
Yeah. We won't go into it all now. I'll say if you go over to Ward Carroll, Mooch Carroll's Instagram and YouTube, he has a sort of nice write-up on the assessment of the impact photos, and then also all the gear the guys are wearing right now. So shout out to Mooch there, and you can check that out. We won't belabor that here. But all right, thank you for your time, Shine. Any closing thoughts here?
I just can't emphasize enough how much of a miracle it was. Twofold miracle, right? So something landing that close to San Diego, downtown San Diego, no one on the ground was hurt, and the air crew survived. So got it. We gave a jet back to the taxpayers, as we say, right? So we gave a jet back, but no loss of life. So nothing short of a miracle. I'm just so glad everyone's okay. And the Navy is in the process of doing a full-scale investigation. These jets have black boxes of sorts, and in this case, the black box is jettisoned from between the tails at the time of ejection.
Oh.
So it didn't follow the aircraft into the bottom of the San Diego Bay there, and it's brightly colored. So my guess is they recovered the black box, and they can also talk to the aviators to get the full picture.
All right. Yeah, I will just echo that by saying if you've never lived in San Diego, there is no part of that area around San Diego Bay that is not densely populated. So very thankful for the miracle. Thankful the crew is out safe. And we'll come back when there's more information on this. And for those of you who listen to Shine and I talk about the Gettysburg and Red Ripper shoot down, we know that you guys had some questions and we've not been able to get back to you. And I can't tell you why not, other than to say I call Sunshine the most interesting man in the world. He got called away for real world tasking I'm not at liberty to talk about. And we'll leave that there. But we will get back to you to answer those questions. And as we get more here on this incident, we'll fill you in. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks again.